Francis. Thank you, Mary Francis. I'm going to present on the latest greenhouse gas emissions projections, a report we produce annually to inform national users, largely using information produced to meet EU legal requirements. In my presentation, I'll go through some of the key trends and takeaway messages, focusing a bit on the individual sectors, and then a bit more on the new developments such as COVID and what's happening in the programme for government. The EPA has a very broad remit in the climate area, and as you can see from the list of activities here, it spans regulation, monitoring and reporting, research and engagement. The inventories and projections team we're presenting here today compiles greenhouse gas figures for Ireland according to standards and guidelines agreed internationally, particularly IPCC guidelines and what we produce for the EU. Ireland's figures are submitted on an annual basis to the EU and UN, where they are reviewed and have been found to be transparent, consistent, comparable, complete and accurate. These figures are important on a national level also in terms of our projections to guide policy making and also to track progress with delivery of plans such as the Climate Action Plan. While the EPA has the lead statutory responsibility for inventory compilation and projection estimation, we work in cooperation with other agencies and bodies that provide essential data and modelling for the various sectors across the economy, underpinning the inventories and projections. So the slide shows the main actors who do contribute to our work, and the key ones for the projections here today would be the ESRI, who produce the underlying macroeconomic projections, the SEI, who produce the energy projections and impact of policies and measures, and Teagasc, who produce the agriculture projections. The key takeaway messages, Laura has hit on already some of them. The measures set out in the plan can see current EU targets being met. We're looking at the measures that we're looking at are almost 1 million electric vehicles on Irish roads by 2030 in the transport sector, which is projected to reduce transport emissions by 38%. 70% renewable energy and electricity generation by 2030, and along with interconnection and the overall reduction in emissions in the additional measure scenario is projected to be 34% by 2030 compared to the 2018 level. As Laura has hit on already, this is sufficient to meet the EU targets, but in relation to keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees, the UN has already highlighted that we're not on track for that, and that further measures will be required to deliver that. And that's something that we will be able to model in the future when the estimates or when the measures to deliver the programme for government are spelled out in greater detail. Finally, just to point out that in terms of meeting the EU targets, Ireland has the ability to use a land use flexibility, and our assumptions are that we are using that in full. And that flexibility was available, recognising in Ireland that we have a large portion of agriculture emissions, and agriculture emissions are inherently more difficult to mitigate. So that assumption is being made, and we'll see that later on when we come to the compliance. Ireland is projected to meet the EU targets for 21 to 30, but it's important to note that we're still projecting non-compliance with the 2013 to 2020 limits, and as the target for that was 20% below 2005 levels in 2020, and at the moment we're projecting somewhere between 2 and 4%. Now that doesn't, as Laura highlighted, incorporate the impact of COVID-19, which will become clearer towards the end of the year. So looking at the overall trend, although our projections extend to 2040, the key policies and measures impacting the numbers apply largely in the 21 to 30 period. So I'll focus a little later on what happens beyond that. What we're seeing here is a 2% reduction in the existing measures scenario, which largely incorporates the measures announced in the 2018 National Development Plan, and a 23% reduction by 2030 on the 2018 level with additional measures scenario, which largely incorporates the measures from the Climate Action Plan. And that is, as Laura pointed out, is a 79 million tonne saving over the 21 to 30 period compared to the with existing measure scenario, an average annual reduction of just under 3%. Taking a look then at the projected changes in sectoral emissions profile, we can see that the impact of some sectors decarbonising faster than others is quite clear. So a lot of the key measures that are in the Climate Action Plan affect transport, electricity and energy efficiency in particular, and you can see transport, energy industries and residential there impacted by those measures are all going to form a smaller share of our emissions in the future. Agriculture, although it's increasing there, the agriculture emissions are projected to decline, but just not quite as fast as the other sectors underneath. And other sectors are becoming more relevant now, because the measures that are, there's not as many significant measures in, say, manufacturing, combustion or industrial process use as there are in energy and transport. So kind of as the others go down, they are staying at a fairly stable level, and so the share of the overall profile increases. Focusing now into some of the sectors, we'll start with agriculture as being the biggest contributor to the emissions at just about a third of overall. So agriculture emissions are projected to continue to grow in the short term in the existing measure scenario as the dairy herd expands. But the Climate Action Plan does envisage 16.5 million tonnes savings over the 21 to 30 period in agriculture, and in that you can see that in the graph. That's resulting in a 12% reduction compared to 2018 level in agriculture. The measures being implemented there include the use of protected urea fertilizers and low emission slurry spreading in particular. Just a very quick slide on the sensitivity analysis around agriculture. We do sensitivity analysis in comparison to our existing measures scenarios annually, and this year we have two scenarios, two sensitivity scenarios for agriculture. The baseline and the existing measures there is the S1, the one in the middle. The S2 scenario is a hard Brexit scenario. It's a scenario where the beef industry in particular is harder hit, and dairy cow numbers also decline somewhat in that scenario to 1.5 million compared to 1.6 million in 2030 in the existing measure scenario. And total cattle numbers are about 6.6 million in 2030 in the S2 scenario. And the S3 scenario, which is a stronger growth scenario, sees cattle numbers increasing compared to the existing measures with a higher profitability assumed, and total cattle numbers in that scenario are projected to be 7.6 million, which is about 5% increase relative to 2018. I mean, what we're seeing from that particular graph is that the difference between the top line and the bottom line of approximately 1 million cattle numbers, and that having an impact of about 2 million tonnes in 2030 on overall agriculture sector emissions. But the impact is lessened compared to if because the impact is largely on the non-dairy animals, the effect isn't as strong as it would be if it was dairy animals that were affected. Moving on to the transport sector, we can see some substantial decreases being projected here, and the existing measure scenario, the top line, which incorporates approximately 500,000 electric vehicles from the National Development Plan, is, as you can see, eclipsed by the additional measure scenario where we're seeing almost 1 million electric vehicles, and the biofuel obligation scheme being developed further to a 10% blend for petrol and 12% blend for diesel in 2030. So in the additional measure scenario, we're projecting agriculture emissions decreasing by 37.8% over the period 2019 to 2030 to 7.6 million tonnes CO2 equivalent in 2030. The existing measures, on the other hand, is a decline of 7.6% to 11.2 million tonnes. And then just having a look at the kind of uptake rate that's being projected here, and this is the EV uptake being projected in the Climate Action Plan, and as you can see from that, it's almost 1 million electric vehicles, 935,000 in total, approximately 550,000 battery electric and 288,000 plug-in hybrids. So and on top of that, there is also the increased biofuel use. In the energy side, with existing measure scenario, energy industries emissions are projected to decrease 18% to 2030, and that's to about 8.7 million tonnes total emissions. With additional measure scenario, projects a 70% renewable energy goal, and it also projects an increased an earlier shutdown of peat and coal. So in that scenario, we're seeing emissions decline by 34% by 2030 compared to the 2018 level to just around 7 million tonnes CO2 equivalent. And again, looking at some of the measures on the energy side, the 70% renewable commitment is essentially, there are different pathways to produce this, and this is just reflecting one possible pathway highlighted in the Climate Action Plan in terms of the uptake of onshore and offshore wind. But essentially, this is in or around a tripling of the generation capacity, the renewable generation capacity, whilst phasing out coal and peat use. And increased renewables and greater interconnection are projected to result overall in a 34% reduction, as I was just pointing out there in the previous slide. Moving now on to compliance and the emissions relevant for the effort sharing decision. So these exclude the emissions trading sector emissions, which are predominantly those from power generation and energy intensive industry. In this situation, we can see that agriculture and transport play a much bigger role. So and the relative proportions of agriculture and transport are projected to change between 2020 and 2030, so that agriculture becomes a bigger factor. And that's because despite the fact that agriculture emissions are decreasing, that transport emissions and also in this graph residential emissions are also decreasing faster. So that's they're the key components. As I was pointing out at the start, the 2020 compliance picture is not looking too good, even with a substantial decrease in 2020 caused by COVID. We don't expect that the compliance with the overall 2013 to 2020 targets will be met without purchase of emission allocations from other countries. In relation to the 21 to 30 compliance picture, this graph tries to present quite a lot of information, and if we can see on the bottom dotted red line, that is the base target, the 30% below the 2005 level, and that is the projected trajectory needed to meet that. The heavy blue line slightly above that is the same trajectory, but with the LULUCF flexibility added in, and the dotted grey line just underneath the blue line is our projected trajectory. So as you can see, the additional measures projected trajectory there is just underneath the compliance trajectory with the LULUCF flexibility added, which means we're in compliance with projecting compliance with each individual year, as well as compliance overall with the effort sharing regulation requirements. The other couple of lines on that graph, with existing measures line at the top, highlights that in that scenario we won't be in compliance, so it really does require the implementation in full of the measures in the Climate Action Plan to hit those targets. And the heavy dashed orange line is if we brought in an additional flexibility that is available to us in relation to ETS, which is detailed in the effort sharing regulation. Just to have a look at what those numbers look like in terms of a carbon budget. So in the case of the projections, the third row there, the projected emission allocations, we're saying the budget is about 378 million tonnes. The WAM scenario, the additional measure scenario itself, the line just above that, is coming out at 396 million tonnes. So there is an exceedance at a gross basis of just under 18 million tonnes, which is the bottom row. But when we do add in the LULUCF flexibility, which comes out to 26.8 million tonnes over the period, that results in a surplus of just under 9 million tonnes over the 21 to 30 period in the additional measure scenario. Finally, in terms of compliance with national policy position, as you can see from this, the 2030 level is underneath the linear pathway, if you like, from 2018 to the 2050 level, which would require under around about 5 million tonnes. That's an 80% reduction in electricity generation, built environment and transport emissions, and that's all that's been reflected in this graph, CO2 emissions, I should say. But if you look at the 2035 and 2040 levels, we don't have the policies in place as of yet to indicate that the additional measures that will be implemented post 2030 and how they would affect the trajectory to 2050. So for now, we're saying that we're more or less on track or on that trajectory with these projections to 2030, but we still need additional policies beyond that to indicate how we will meet the 2050 target. And we are aware that there is a new target being proposed in the programme for government. So the target the national policy position may change in the near future. And that brings me on to when we go beyond compliance. As Laura pointed out, the emissions gap report last year highlighted that with the current commitments that we're on course for a 3.2 degree temperature rise globally, and that we need to see 7.6% per year global average every year between 2021 and 2030 in global emissions to be on track towards limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Programme for Government has a commitment in there to an average 70% per annum reduction in overall greenhouse gas emissions from 21 to 30, which is over 50% a reduction over the decade. And that's something that will obviously require a big step up on the Climate Action Plan measures, which in total produce about a 23% decline. So it does indicate the scale of the challenge and the ambition in the Programme for Government to achieve that. Finally, just a little bit about what we're seeing at the moment in relation to the impact of the pandemic. This fuel graph is a combined petrol and diesel sale figures in litres for the year to end of May, coming from the National Oil Reserves Agency, and we're seeing that we have a 31% decline in petrol sales and over 20% decline in diesel sales. And what that's going to do is going to translate into emission reductions, in particularly in transport, in this case. But then also we have seen some analysis from the SEI on electricity daily demand, comparing daily electricity usage from air grid data for the first 24 weeks of the year. And you can see a substantial decline here that occurred from the start of the lockdown, with the current indications that average daily electricity demand is 15 or 20% lower, certainly during the first week of the lockdown restrictions compared to the previous month. It's very difficult to say anything 100% concrete. As you can see, even before the lockdown, there was big differences year on year between 2019 and 2020, and that's because electricity demand is highly correlated with weather events. So it will take later in the year when more detailed analysis will be able to try and extract the underlying demand effect from the weather and other impacts and other variabilities. I think the occurrence of Easter and so on has an impact as well. So what we can say with certainty, though, is that we are likely to see a decline. As we can see the crossover point there, just straight away at the lockdown, the demand figures had been running higher in 2020 before then. So that's the summary of the data. We'll obviously be able to answer your questions later in relation to in the Q&A scenario. But just to reiterate the conclusions that Laura has hit on already, we're talking about the Climate Action Plan giving us compliance with the 2030 EU targets. And that's because we're seeing a 23% reduction by 2030 in emissions, with a 3% annual average reduction over the period 21 to 30. We are relying on maximising the use of land, so we're using the land use flexibility, which relates to forestry activity and also measures in grassland and wetland are potentially included. Even further measures are required to meet national EU ambition to keep global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And again, just this final thing, we need the right measures in the right place, and this applies particularly to land use measures. It's not the same measure everywhere, and similarly in relation to transport and energy efficiency measures, they all need to be targeted effectively to deliver the long-term improvement required. You can learn more on our website, www.epa.ie/GHG. This is a web resource which presents, broken down by sector and by gas, our projections and inventory data. If we have any further questions, we'll take them at the end. So thank you very much for that, and I will hand back to Mary Frances.